During the siege of Leningrad in the winter of 1942, when the German blockade had lasted 5 months and the city's residents faced starvation on an unprecedented scale, 10-year-old Pyotr Vasiliev began to understand that survival required feeding the stove with more than just wood and coal. The fire in the corner of their communal apartment had been burning for 37 days straight. A small miracle in a city where most families had long since burned their furniture, their books, and anything else that would catch flame. Pyotr's mother, Yelena, tended it with the devotion of a priestess, carefully rationing each piece of fuel to ensure the precious warmth would last through another freezing night. The boy watched her thin fingers arrange and rearrange the meager scraps of wood, her movements precise and economical, wasting nothing. At first, they had burned the obvious things. The dining table his grandfather had crafted decades earlier went into the flames piece by piece, followed by the chairs, the wooden picture frames, and the stack of old newspapers his father had collected before the war. When those were gone, they moved to the books. Pyotr's beloved collection of adventure stories disappeared into the hungry flames, followed by his mother's recipe books, his father's technical manuals, and finally, painfully, the family Bible that had belonged to his grandmother. But even books could not sustain a fire through the endless winter nights. And soon Yelena was venturing into the abandoned apartments throughout their building, returning with floorboards, door frames, and anything else that would burn. The building itself was slowly being consumed from within, sacrificed to keep its remaining inhabitants alive. Pyotr learned to ignore the sounds that came from the other apartments, the scraping and splintering as his neighbors systematically dismantled their homes board by board. The boy's understanding of necessity began to evolve in subtle ways. When old Pavel Fedorov died in his sleep in the apartment below, Pyotr watched through the crack in their door as the other residents carefully removed the man's wooden leg before taking his body to the courtyard. The prosthetic burned for 3 precious hours, its varnished surface giving off a sweet, chemical smell that made Pyotr's empty stomach churn. His mother explained that Pavel would have understood, would have wanted them to survive. But the boy detected something hollow in her voice that suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as him. The siege had transformed the city into a laboratory of human endurance, where each day brought new tests of what people could justify in the name of survival. Pyotr began to notice how his neighbors' conversations had changed, how they spoke in whispers about things that would have been unthinkable just months before. The Petrovs in apartment 12 had taken to boiling leather belts and shoes to make a thin, bitter soup. The elderly Kozlov woman had been seen scraping wallpaper paste from the walls, eating the glutinous mixture with the desperation of someone whose body was consuming itself from within. And as winter deepened and the bread rations dwindled to 125 grams per day, Pyotr's mother began to speak of things that made the boy's skin crawl. She mentioned, in passing, how the Siege Museum had been forced to close after curators discovered that some of the exhibits had been tampered with. Precious historical artifacts, disappearing piece by piece. She told him about the reports of people digging up bodies from the frozen ground, not for burial, but for reasons that she couldn't bring herself to articulate fully. The boy learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished the survivors from those who were slowly giving up. The survivors had a particular look in their eyes, a hardness that came from making calculations that would have horrified their former selves. They spoke less, smiled never, and viewed every interaction through the lens of advantage and disadvantage. Mrs. Volkov, who had once been the kindest woman in their building, now counted every grain of sugar, every crumb of bread, measuring her generosity with a precision that would have shamed a miser. When Pyotr's baby sister stopped crying and then stopped moving altogether, his mother's transformation accelerated. The grief that should have overwhelmed her instead seemed to crystallize into something harder and more pragmatic. She held the tiny body for hours, rocking back and forth. But her tears had long since dried up, another luxury that starvation had stolen from her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a terrible calmness that frightened the boy more than any screaming would have. The neighbors gathered that evening, ostensibly to pay their respects. But Pyotr could see the way their eyes lingered on the small bundle in his mother's arms. No one spoke the words that hung in the air like toxic smoke. But the boy could feel the weight of their collective calculation. In a city where people had learned to see everything through the lens of survival, even grief had become another resource to be managed and allocated. And old Mrs. Semenova, who had once taught piano to the children in their building, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. Her words came out in a whisper, so quiet that Pyotr had to strain to hear them, but their meaning was unmistakable. She spoke of practicality, of the harsh mathematics of survival, of the duty they owed to the living over the dead. The other adults nodded slowly, their faces masks of forced rationality that barely concealed the horror of what they were contemplating. Pyotr's mother listened to these whispered suggestions with a face carved from stone, her fingers still stroking the baby's cold cheek. When she finally responded, her voice carried the weight of a decision that would haunt her for whatever remained of her life. She spoke of the fire that needed feeding, of the night ahead that promised to be the coldest yet, of the terrible arithmetic that governed their world, where every calorie was measured against the possibility of tomorrow. The boy watched his mother's face as she made her choice, saw the moment when the last vestige of the woman she had been disappeared forever. What remained was something harder and more terrible, a creature sculpted by necessity and desperation into a shape that could survive what no human being should have to endure. She handed the bundle to Mrs. Semenova with the same mechanical precision she used to tend the fire, each movement careful and deliberate. That night, as the flames consumed what had once been his sister, Pyotr learned that the fire in their stove was not just fed by wood and coal and books and furniture. It was fed by pieces of their humanity, sacrificed bit by bit to the merciless god of survival. The heat it gave off warmed their bodies, but froze something deeper, something that would never thaw even if they lived to see the spring. And the boy understood, with a clarity that would torment him for the rest of his life, that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. They had fed the fire with more than fuel. They had fed it with their souls, and in doing so had discovered that the boundary between civilization and savagery was far thinner than anyone had imagined. The warmth that kept them alive came at a price that transformed into something other than human, something that could make the impossible calculations and live with the impossible choices. In the weeks that followed, as the siege ground on and the city's remaining population continued to dwindle, Pyotr watched his neighbors make similar choices. The fire in their stove was not unique. Every flame in the city was fed by the same terrible fuel. Every family was forced to confront the same horrific arithmetic. They had become a community of the damned, bound together not by shared values or common purpose, but by the knowledge of what they had done to survive. And the boy learned to tend the fire himself, feeding it with the same methodical care his mother had taught him, never allowing himself to think too deeply about the nature of the fuel. He learned to make the same cold calculations, to view the world through the same pitiless lens that had consumed his mother's humanity. By the time the siege was lifted and the first relief convoys arrived, Pyotr had become something other than the child he had been, shaped by the fire that had kept him alive and the price it had demanded. Years later, when he was an old man living in a world that had moved on from the horrors of war, Pyotr would still wake some nights in a cold sweat, remembering the smell of that fire and what they had fed it to keep it burning. He would remember his mother's face in the firelight, transformed from the woman who had once sung him lullabies into something hard and necessary and terrible. He would remember the moment when survival became more important than humanity, when the fire demanded not just fuel but sacrifice, when ordinary people learned that they could endure anything if the alternative was death. The fire had kept them alive, but it had consumed something irreplaceable in the process, leaving them hollow vessels, carrying the weight of impossible choices. They had survived the siege, but something essential had been lost in those flames, something that no amount of time or healing could ever restore. What they fed the fire had kept them breathing, but it had also transformed them into creatures that their former selves would have failed to recognize, monuments to the terrible plasticity of human nature when pressed beyond all reasonable limits.